Hello, this is Susan Guy, and I'm going to be speaking with you today about biological psychology. This is the first in a series of lectures for the biological basis of human behavior, and I'm a psychiatrist with a background in neurobehavior. So, what is biological psychology? Well, it's known as several other things, depending on what department, what school you're in. And there are a lot of overlaps of different disciplines involved in the study of biological psychology, also known as behavioral neurology, behavioral neuroscience, or neuropsychiatry or neuropsychology. And basically, it's the study of the biological basis of psychological processes and behavior, whereas neuroscience is the study of the nervous system. So here are some different disciplines that you can see all come together and factor in what we know as biological psychology. So not just the studies of psychiatry and neurology, but also anthropology, computer science involved in imaging, endocrinology, immunology, genetics. Many different types of folks can contribute to research in this area. And there's some basic vocab words that we're going to need to become familiar with as we start on our journey in this discipline. First would be neurons or nerve cells, and they're the basic unit of the nervous system. Synapses are areas where the neurons make contacts with each other, and then the axon and dendrites are specialized extensions of neurons that send, that would be the axon, and receive, that would be the dendrites, information respectively from neurons. And we'll talk more about that as we go into the neuroanatomy lectures as well. So here's some basic fun numbers about the brain. First of all, did you know that you can do surgery on the brain without anesthetizing it because it doesn't have any pain receptors? So for some epilepsy type of surgeries, they're actually done with the patient wide awake. There are more than 10 trillion synapses in the human brain, which is equal to the number of the cells in the rest of the entire body. The blood supply to the brain is pretty extensive. There's 400 miles of capillaries in it. And it's just an amazing organ, a little world inside our own bodies. So there are different perspectives in studying the biological basis of behavior, and these have to do with all the different disciplines that are involved in studying it. One perspective would be just to describe behavior. The other would be studying the evolution of the behavior, and another is observing the development of the behavior and its biological characteristics over a person's lifespan. Fourth would be studying biological mechanisms of behavior, and then applied science. How do we apply what we know from biological psychology to help people live better lives? Some more vocab here. When a trait is conserved, that means that similar appearances are resulting from them having a common ancestor. And then there's convergent evolution, which is similar solutions evolving independently to deal with a similar problem. For instance, in order to fly, both a bat and butterfly have wings, but they're not very related at all. Behaviors that change over a lifespan are studied to learn about functions and mechanisms. Development is known as ontogeny, and it's the change of the individual over the course of its lifespan, in contrast to evolution, which is also known as phylogeny. And here's a really cool illustration from a guy named Ernst Haeckel, who is a physician and artist who actually came up with the term protista, named the kingdom Protista, and came up with the terms ecology and phylogeny. And his idea was that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, so that as something develops as an embryo, it goes through the different stages of its evolution as it evolves into a young organism. This was later shown to be false, but it's kind of a cool theory, and his art is amazing. So how do we study neuroscience of behavior? One way is to manipulate the body to see how that affects behavior. So we might give somebody a hormone or stimulate a part of the brain electrically, or put connections between parts of the nervous system to see what happens. Or we might try to see how experience affects the body, including the brain. So we might put a male in the presence of a female and see if hormone levels change, present a visual stimulus to see if there's changes in electrical activity in the brain, and give training to see if that causes anatomical changes in the brain. So a correlation measures how much a particular measure varies with another measure. And here we're talking about how physical measure will change in relation to a behavioral measure. But correlation does not imply causation. So even though things may vary or change with each other, it doesn't mean that one is causing the other. They could be completely independent. So for instance, brain size might be correlated with learning scores, but that doesn't mean that a bigger brain necessarily results in better scores on tests. And for instance, there are enlarged cerebral ventricles in schizophrenic people, but does that mean that enlarged ventricles cause schizophrenia, or is there something else going on that's completely different? For instance, do schizophrenic people eat more popcorn than people who aren't schizophrenic, and is that associated with enlarged cerebral ventricles, or is there something else completely different that's causing this? So biological psychology seeks to understand all these different types of relationships. So what happens when we intervene by an experiment where we affect the physical body or the brain, or what happens when we try to change the brain by changing behavior, and how are two different variables correlated, and can we learn anything from that and design studies to check whether or not these correlations are in fact causations. Neuroplasticity describes the ability of the brain to be changed by environment and experience. And this is very exciting because we now know that the brain can actually change physically in a matter of seconds through dendritic spines adjusting to their environment. And we also know that this change can occur not only during development, but also in adulthood. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the lectures as well. So social interactions can result in brain changes. We're going to look at rats for a second. In rats, social isolation leads to changes in specific areas of the brain. And play can also affect the rat's brain. And we'll take a look at this here, where you can see that if a rat is social, there are certain parts of the brain that actually are more developed or larger than if the rat is kept in isolation. In humans, psychological expectation can actually affect the magnitude of a response. So this is another example of neuroplasticity. So if you tell somebody, wow, this is going to be really, 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 really hot, then if you look at that person's activation of certain brain areas on functional neuroimaging, you'll see that they actually do experience the water as hotter because they expect it to be hotter, and they'll also tell you through their subjective experience that they felt like it was hotter than somebody who was just allowed to experience it without having been fed expectations ahead of time. So the next slide here shows the difference in intensity of a person who was told it was going to get really, really, really hot when they put their hand in the water versus someone who was just allowed to experience it for themselves. So when we are looking at studying behavioral neuroscience, we want to think about the level of analysis, the level at which we're looking at things. And we might break it down very, very small and get really reductionistic and look at the molecules involved, or we might not, and we might look at the organism and more ecological interaction or anthropology. So here, starting out, for instance, at the social level, we might break it down, get more and more reductionistic as we go along, looking at the organ level, the brain, the spinal cord, down to the neurosystems level. What about the eyes and the visual system? What's going on here when the social interaction is occurring? Or maybe you might want to look at circuits or even cells or the synapse and the molecular level. So there's different types of scientists that may work on different levels. For instance, social anthropologist or ecologist might look at the big picture, whereas a neuroanatomist might look at more reductionistic, more in-depth analysis of molecular effects. So the biological psychology that is an applied science, and that it can help us understand brain disorders and devise treatments for people with psychiatric or neurobehavioral problems. And 1 in 5 people suffers from some sort of psychiatric or neurological disorder. So it's a pretty widespread problem. And clinical as well as laboratory approaches are both important in this research. And often these are different types of people doing these studies, and may start out in the lab, and then there can be clinical trials of different types of treatments that are introduced before they're available mainstream for people to get improvement from their disorders. So here's some just estimates of prevalence of neurological disorders, so you can get some idea of it. There are 2 million people with epilepsy. Alzheimer's is 2,500,000. A lot of people who have strokes also in the U.S. Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, cerebral palsy, and head and spinal cord trauma are also big problems. Psychiatric disorders, again, huge numbers here. Alcohol and drug abuse, 45 million. Anxiety disorders, 85 million. So this is something where a lot of good can be done by treating people. So there are a lot of questions that can arise from observations. So some folks observed that in twin studies, the folks who, in the identical twins who have schizophrenia, have enlarged ventricles. And they also found that there's only a 50% concordance rate in identical twins with the person, one twin, having schizophrenia or not. So there's only 50% at the time will both twins have schizophrenia. So what is going on if these people are genetically identical, that their brains look different and that they have very different clinical presentations? There are other areas that we really don't know very much about, and can be a really big area for study. And one is consciousness, and that's being aware of one's own existence and experience. And it's very important and somehow connected to brain activity, but we really don't understand how. So if that's something that interests you, that's wide open for research. So that was just a basic introduction to biological basis of human behavior, and we'll get in a lot more depth as we proceed. Thank you.